Have you ever watched someone make a decision and known exactly what they were going to choose before they even realized it themselves? Have you ever been in a conversation where you could predict not just what the person would say next, but how they would react to your response, what emotions they would display, and what they would do afterward? This isn't mind reading. This isn't supernatural intuition. This is what Niccolo Machiavelli called the science of human nature. And once you understand it, people don't become mysterious, complex, or unpredictable anymore. They become as readable as an open book, written in a language you've suddenly learned to speak fluently. Machiavelli spent his life studying power, politics, and human behavior at the highest levels of society. But what he discovered wasn't just applicable to princes and politicians. He uncovered fundamental patterns in human psychology that govern how every person responds to fear, desire, pressure, and opportunity. Patterns so consistent that once you learn to recognize them, human behavior becomes almost mathematically predictable. Today, I'm going to share with you Machiavelli's most closely guarded secret. The one insight that made him the most feared advisor in Renaissance Italy, not because he was cruel, but because he could predict with terrifying accuracy exactly how people would behave in any given situation. What I'm about to show you isn't manipulation or control over others. This is about understanding human nature so deeply that you can navigate social situations, professional environments, and personal relationships with a level of strategic awareness that most people never develop. You'll know what people are likely to do before they do it, not through guesswork, but through pattern recognition. Machiavelli wrote, "Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved." But what he really understood was something more profound. Human behavior is driven by a small number of fundamental motivations, and these motivations create predictable response patterns in every person you'll ever meet. If you want to understand the hidden psychological patterns that govern human behavior and how to use this knowledge to make better decisions in every area of your life, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We explore the strategic insights that can transform how you understand and interact with people. Once you master what I'm about to teach you, you'll never again be surprised by someone's betrayal, confused by someone's sudden change in behavior, or blindsided by decisions that seem to come out of nowhere. You'll see them coming from miles away because you'll understand the psychological forces that drive them. The thing that makes people completely predictable isn't complex. It's actually remarkably simple. But it's hidden beneath layers of social conditioning, self-deception, and the stories people tell themselves about why they do what they do. First principle. Machiavelli discovered that all human behavior is driven by what he called the two great motivators, the pursuit of gain and the avoidance of loss. But here's what makes this insight so powerful for predicting behavior. People will always act more decisively to avoid loss than to pursue gain. And they'll always underestimate how much their decisions are influenced by these basic drives. When someone is facing a decision, they're not really weighing options rationally. They're unconsciously calculating what they might lose versus what they might gain. And the fear of loss will almost always dominate their thinking, even when they're not aware of it. This is why people make seemingly irrational decisions that become completely predictable once you understand their loss-avoidance psychology. The person who stays in a job they hate isn't choosing security over happiness. They're choosing the known loss of dissatisfaction over the unknown loss of financial instability. The person who won't end a relationship that's clearly not working isn't choosing love over loneliness. They're choosing the familiar loss of an unfulfilling partnership over the uncertain loss of companionship. Watch how people respond when you present them with choices. They'll almost always gravitate toward the option that feels safest, not the option that offers the most potential benefit. Even ambitious, successful people are primarily motivated by loss avoidance, though they've learned to frame their loss avoidance as opportunity seeking. Machiavelli used this understanding to predict exactly how political leaders would respond to different scenarios. He could anticipate their alliances, their betrayals, their strategic decisions, not because he knew them personally, but because he understood that their behavior was governed by predictable calculations about what they had to lose. You can apply this same insight to predict how anyone will behave in situations involving career decisions, relationship choices, financial investments, or social conflicts. Ask yourself, what does this person perceive they have to lose, and how does that fear compare to what they might gain? Their behavior will follow their loss avoidance calculations with remarkable consistency. Second principle. People are completely predictable once you understand what Machiavelli called the hierarchy of needs disguised as values. Most people believe their decisions are based on their values, principles, or moral commitments. But Machiavelli observed that these apparent values always arrange themselves in a predictable hierarchy when people are under pressure. At the bottom of everyone's hierarchy, whether they admit it or not, is physical safety and basic security. Above that is social acceptance and reputation. Above that is personal comfort and convenience. At the top, if it exists at all, are abstract principles like justice, truth, or moral consistency. Here's what makes people predictable. When these levels conflict with each other, people will almost always sacrifice higher levels to protect lower levels, but they'll create sophisticated rationalizations to avoid admitting this to themselves or others. The person who claims to value honesty above all else will lie to protect their reputation. The person who says they believe in justice will ignore injustice when challenging it would threaten their security. The person who talks constantly about loyalty will betray allies when it serves their self-interest. This isn't because people are fundamentally dishonest or hypocritical. It's because human psychology has built-in survival priorities that override conscious values when those values conflict with deeper needs. Machiavelli used this understanding to predict exactly when allies would become enemies, when principles would be abandoned, when moral positions would shift. He could see these changes coming because he understood that people's stated values are less reliable predictors of behavior than their unstated hierarchy of needs. Watch how people behave when their security is threatened versus when it's stable. Notice how their moral positions shift when their reputation is at risk. Observe how their loyalty changes when their comfort is challenged. These patterns will reveal their true hierarchy of needs, which will allow you to predict their future behavior with remarkable accuracy. The person who understands this isn't cynical about human nature. They're realistic about human psychology, and this realism allows them to navigate relationships and situations with much greater strategic awareness. Third principle. Machiavelli realized that people become completely predictable when you understand what he called the stories they tell themselves to sleep at night. Everyone has internal narratives about who they are, why they do what they do, and what their actions mean. But these stories are not accurate descriptions of reality. They're psychological comfort mechanisms that allow people to maintain their self-image while pursuing their actual motivations. The key insight is that people will consistently act to protect these internal stories, even when protecting the stories requires them to act against their stated interests or values. Their behavior isn't driven by who they actually are, but by who they need to believe they are. The person who sees themselves as generous will make financial decisions that appear generous, even when they're actually motivated by guilt, social pressure, or image management. The person who identifies as independent will reject help or advice even when accepting it would clearly benefit them, because accepting support would threaten their self-concept. The person who believes they're rational and logical will stick to obviously poor decisions rather than admit they were wrong, because changing course would challenge their identity as someone who thinks things through carefully. This is what makes human behavior so predictable once you understand someone's core self-stories. They'll consistently choose actions that reinforce their self-image over actions that serve their practical interests. And they'll create elaborate justifications for why these identity-protecting choices are actually the smart, principled, or logical thing to do. Machiavelli observed that the most successful political manipulations worked not by appealing to people's actual interests, but by appealing to their need to see themselves in a particular way. You could get people to act against their own interests as long as you framed the action as consistent with their self-image. You can use this same understanding to predict how people will respond to different approaches, requests, or situations. Ask yourself, what story does this person tell themselves about who they are? How would different options threaten or reinforce that story? They'll almost always choose the path that allows them to maintain their preferred self-narrative, even when that path is obviously suboptimal from an outside perspective. Fourth principle. People reveal their predictable patterns through what Machiavelli called the consistency of their inconsistencies. Everyone believes they're complex, unique, and unpredictable. But Machiavelli discovered that people are actually remarkably consistent in their behavioral patterns, especially in how they handle stress, conflict, opportunity, and pressure. The person who avoids confrontation in their personal relationships will also avoid confrontation in professional situations, even when directness would serve them better. The person who makes impulsive decisions when they're excited will make impulsive decisions whether they're excited about a relationship, a business opportunity, or a major purchase. The person who needs external validation to feel confident will seek that validation in every area of their life, from their career choices to their social media posting patterns to how they handle disagreements with friends. These patterns persist across different contexts because they emerge from deep psychological structures that don't change quickly or easily. People develop habitual ways of processing fear, desire, uncertainty, and opportunity, and these habits show up consistently regardless of the specific situation. Machiavelli used this insight to predict how political figures would respond to new situations by studying how they had responded to similar psychological pressures in different contexts. He could anticipate their decision-making patterns, their emotional reactions, their strategic choices, because he understood that past behavior in analogous situations was the best predictor of future behavior. You can develop the same predictive ability by observing how people handle similar psychological dynamics across different areas of their lives. Notice how they respond to criticism, how they handle success, how they deal with uncertainty, how they manage conflicts. These response patterns will repeat consistently across different situations. The person who becomes defensive when their professional judgment is questioned will also become defensive when their personal choices are challenged. The person who takes credit for successes while blaming failures on external factors will follow this pattern whether they're talking about their career, their relationships, or their financial decisions. Understanding these patterns doesn't just help you predict behavior. It helps you understand how to communicate with people in ways that work with their psychological patterns rather than against them. Fifth principle. Machiavelli discovered that people become most predictable during what he called moments of revealed priority, situations where they can't maintain all their various self-images, social commitments, and competing interests simultaneously. These moments force people to show what they actually value most, regardless of what they claim to value. Crisis situations, major opportunities, resource scarcity, time pressure, social conflict. These circumstances strip away the complexity and reveal the simple hierarchy of what people will actually prioritize when forced to choose. The person who talks about work-life balance will reveal their true priorities when offered a promotion that requires longer hours. The person who claims to value honesty above all else will show their real values when telling the truth would cost them something significant. The person who says loyalty is their most important quality will demonstrate their actual loyalty limits when maintaining loyalty becomes expensive or socially awkward. Machiavelli used these moments of revealed priority to understand the true character and predictable future behavior of political allies and enemies. He knew that what people do when they can't have everything they want is far more reliable than what they do when maintaining all their various commitments is easy and costless. You can use this same insight to understand the people in your personal and professional life. Pay attention to how they behave when resources are limited, when they're under pressure, when they have to choose between competing loyalties, when maintaining their various social commitments becomes difficult. These moments reveal their true hierarchy of values, which allows you to predict how they'll behave in future situations that create similar conflicts between their stated values and their revealed priorities. The person who prioritizes their reputation over their relationships during one crisis will make the same choice in future crises. The person who sacrifices their principles to maintain their comfort when stakes are high will follow the same pattern when stakes are high again. And here, we reach the heart of Machiavelli's most powerful insight about human predictability. People are not mysterious, complex, or impossible to understand. They're highly consistent psychological systems operating according to predictable patterns. But these patterns are hidden beneath layers of self-deception, social conditioning, and rationalization. Once you learn to see past these surface layers and identify the underlying psychological drives, behavioral patterns, and priority hierarchies that actually govern human behavior, people become as predictable as any other system operating according to consistent rules. This doesn't mean people are simple or that individual psychology isn't sophisticated. It means that human psychology follows patterns, and these patterns can be learned, recognized, and anticipated by anyone willing to study human nature with the same systematic attention that Machiavelli brought to political behavior. The person who masters this understanding gains what Machiavelli considered the ultimate strategic advantage: the ability to navigate human relationships and social situations based on accurate predictions about how people will behave, rather than on hopes, assumptions, or wishful thinking about human nature. You stop being surprised by betrayals because you can see the conditions that make betrayal likely. You stop being confused by sudden changes in behavior because you understand the psychological pressures that drive these changes. You stop being manipulated by people's stated intentions because you can read their actual motivations and predict their real priorities. This knowledge doesn't make you cynical about humanity. It makes you realistic about human psychology, which allows you to build more authentic relationships, make better decisions about who to trust and how much, and position yourself strategically in situations where understanding human behavior provides crucial advantages. Machiavelli's ultimate insight was that the people who understand human nature most accurately are not the ones who think most highly of human potential, but the ones who accept human limitations most completely. And paradoxically, this acceptance allows for much more effective and mutually beneficial interactions with others. When you stop expecting people to be different than they are and start working with their actual psychological patterns, you can achieve outcomes that serve everyone's interests more effectively than strategies based on idealistic assumptions about how people should behave. The person who masters these insights doesn't become manipulative or exploitative. They become strategically aware, psychologically sophisticated, and remarkably effective at navigating the complex social dynamics that govern most of human life. This is what Machiavelli understood that made him both respected and feared by the most powerful people of his era. Not that he could control human behavior, but that he could predict it with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to people who had never learned to read the consistent patterns underlying apparent human complexity. Your ability to recognize these patterns, to predict behavior based on understanding rather than assumption, to navigate relationships and situations with strategic awareness. This is what transforms you from someone who reacts to human behavior into someone who anticipates it, understands it, and works with it effectively. The next time someone's behavior surprises you, remember what Machiavelli would tell you. You weren't surprised because human behavior is unpredictable. You were surprised because you hadn't yet learned to recognize the patterns that make all human behavior remarkably, almost mathematically, consistent.